Hello and welcome, I'm Kayla Scrivener, and today I'm going to do my April wrap-up. It is June now, but I'm going to go back in time a little bit and talk about the Women's Prize, talk about the Carol Shields Prize, and then also talk about some other books that I read in the month of April. And I had a really good reading month. I found some favorites. I had some hate reads. I did some reviews. It was a good month. So I'm going to talk with all of the books about the Women's Prize. I didn't read them in this order, but I thought I would talk about them here so that they're all compared and contrasted. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Bandit Queens, and I really enjoyed the feminist take on what it feels like to be a woman who is a widow in India. And she is now in her late 30s. Her husband disappeared 5 years ago and left her essentially a widow. And then other women who have troublesome husbands keep showing up and being like, hey, can I have a little favor? Can you kill my husband? And she doesn't really want to get rid of her street cred because she didn't actually kill her husband. And it's a really good and funny book. At some points, I wish that it had been more serious, but overall, I think that it is a great debut, and I can't wait to see what Shroff writes next. I was quite disappointed that this didn't make the shortlist because I definitely think that it was one of the standout books from this year. The next book is The Marriage Portrait, and this is a really good book. I really enjoyed it. It begins with her mother and has her mother like during her conception and then goes throughout her childhood and then intersperses these different scenes about her married life. And it is very good. It looks at what it means to be a girl in Italian society in the 1400s, and it is really powerful in scenes. I'm not completely satisfied with this book as a whole. I think that it has elements of classism, and Lucrezia is the only character who's fully fleshed. Like, her husband definitely switches back and forth and her parents are present and stuff like that, but a lot of the other characters are quite one-dimensional and a lot of them are very mean. Even her mother, who seemed quite kindly when from her point of view, turns into this woman we don't know much about and is quite harsh at times. Her nurse and her maid are really the only people that we kind of see sympathetically throughout the point of the novel, and yet their characters are never fleshed out and they don't always get the best ends. So it leaves like it's a feminist tale for one woman, not a feminist tale for every woman. And then the next book is by an author I still don't know if I want to read her again. I have a whole review going over Cursed Bread because I have complicated thoughts. I think that I like ended up being more negative, and yet everyone kept on telling me they were going to go buy the book because of my review, and I was like, I don't know if that's what I wanted. But I do have so much to discuss in regards to the ways in which this book is talked about. It's advertised as a book about poisoning, but I think that that's false advertisement. It's actually about this woman and her crazy obsession with this other woman, and to a slighter, less degree, her husband. It looks at what it means to be a woman in a small town in France in the 50s, and it's very interesting and it's very obsessive, and it spends a lot of time in the narrator. Like, if you want to be in the cells of her brain, that's kind of what's going on here. There's not a lot of plot, there's not a lot of dialogue, like that's what's going on. And I feel very mixed about it, and I don't know if I want to read more books by her, but maybe. And then I can answer that question for Natalie Haynes because I did immediately read another book by her. So I read Stoneblind and I really loved it. I love Medusa, I love myth retellings, and I am a sucker for this story. I think that the ways in which narration happen, I think the multiple and large ensemble cast, the ways in which it talks about how women are like villainized is really powerful, and I really love this book. And I know that a lot of people look down on books that are retellings. They look down on these books, and I think that that is undeserved, and I don't like it. And I think that this one would have done a great job on the shortlist. I think that it was phenomenally well written and interesting and funny and all of those things. And then I immediately went and read Pandoras Jar, which is her nonfiction book looking at women in Greek myths and how they're represented, and it was also really good and really interesting, and I really liked it. Natalie Haynes is an author I like. For a book that I didn't like is Dog of the North, and this is a book that it's just kind of the funny that I don't like, the trivial that I don't mind, and I don't think I have anything good to say about it. I ranted extensively about this in my vlog for this, because I do have two vlogs. I have reactions to the shortlist, and I also have my predictions for the shortlist, all of which I summarize and talk extensively about these books. But yeah, I was not a fan of this book. And then we moved to Carol Shields Prize, and I really loved these books. One of Your Sisters was a phenomenal book looking at a coming of age about gender and about sisterhood and the perils of being in a female body and coming of age and grief and all of these things, and the way in which Fatima Ashgar plays with form and style is like music to my ears. I really love this. She won, and so well deserved for the inaugural win of the prize. I was just so happy to see this book, What We Fed the Manticore, and I was pleasantly surprised by this. A short story collection looking from the point of view of many animals, and it's interesting, and I have kept some of the stories locked into my brain. I don't think it's the most memorable book and wouldn't be my favorite, but I would definitely be intrigued to see what she writes next. Brown Girls was an immediate favorite. As soon as it started, I knew that I was going to love it. It's a coral wee point of view, and yet it doesn't stay in just one point of view. It looks at this neighborhood in Queens, but it goes through the weeds of how all of these different women disperse throughout their lives. And I really love that, and it captures the nuances and the complexities of what it is to grow up, to how we change about our parents, how we change about our friends, how we change about romance. And it is a book that I felt so represented in, and seen in as a young woman, and the ways in which it happens, and it goes throughout someone's life. And I really treasure it, and When We Were Sisters are two books that I think about a lot, and I think impact me every day when I write. When I think about writing, I think about these books and how can I capture something like that. And I think creativity is something that we should be celebrated. I understand people's desire to be original and stuff like that, but I think that imitation is the best compliment, is the best flattery. And when you read something, you want to imitate because it is so marvelous, and the way in which that author portrays things, all of these books deal with form in such an interesting way, and I loved this book. And then outside of these prize lists, I also read another book that deals with form, and that is Assembly by Natasha Brown, and I really like this book. It follows this young Black British woman who works in, finance, and deals with all of the sexism and racism associated with it, and she's also dating an upper class white man who lives in a family estate, and she goes and visits him, and many things happen. I guess it's more like a dialogue novel. It's not a novel about plot, it's a novel about experience. It talks about how history itself has been erased, and how people talk about telling history and restoring history and stuff like that, and about how important it is because colonialism and the ways and the impacts of racism get taken out of the narrative, so that there is not even a way to rewrite it, because so much of it has been erased. And I think that it's a very impactful novel that I thought about a lot, and it's a novel that I really considered flipping over and starting again, because I had so many thoughts about it. The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green is a book that I spent 2 years reading and writing it. I really enjoyed this book. John Green is one of my favorite authors, and I think more than that, one of my favorite people who exists in the world. That I don't know, that I have a parasocial relationship with. I just really enjoy the ways in which he talks about things. I loved this podcast, and I got a version of it when it first came out in 2021, and I started, and I've just read parts of it, and every single one has entranced me. I wrote my own essays, and I thought about things, and I stopped and I wrote, and some of the hardest times of my life, in the last few years, I've just opened it up and read it. I read it on New Year's in 2021 and in 2022, and it's just become a tradition in my life. And yeah, I love thinking about the world and just his love for his wife. I think I also just really love talking about how love is looking at the same thing at the same time, and it's a third thing. We don't so often not look in each other's eyes, but we enjoy the same things, and we love that. And I know that he's quoting other people when talking about that, but he also contextualizes this in a way that I really, really love. And then I read One True Loves by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is one of her backlisted books before her kind of mega fame, and it was all right. It definitely dealt with relationships and how people changed and developed, and you can see the seeds of the author she will become, because it looks at this woman who married her high school sweetheart, and they, ended up happy together, and then 5 years ago he disappeared. And then she is now re-engaged, and then he comes back and is like, hey, I'm alive. And then she's gone through 5 years and figured out who she is. And it's really an ode to your 20s and to your early 30s, and I felt very represented in the ways that you change, and how romance changes you, and how who you think you are in high school versus who you think you're in your 20s is a totally different person. And yeah, I felt very represented by that. So yeah, I liked that. I didn't love all of it, but it's one of her backlisted old books. This is one of the reasons why I think that retrying authors and giving them a second chance is so cool, because Taylor Jenkins Reid didn't like publish her most famous books until I think 5 or 6 books in, and like you really see like the beginnings of who she would be. But like if I read this book, I would probably be like, I don't need to read another book by her. Meanwhile, like 4 of her books are some of my favorite books of all time. And then I read Scars and Stars, and this is by Jesse Thistle. I previously read and raved about From the Ashes. This is a memoir about his experience of being homeless and addiction and being Métis and kind of the generational trauma of that. And that is a phenomenal book. I didn't love this book so much. It rehashed a lot of the things. There's a book by Maya Angelou called My Mother and Me and My Mother, which recounts a lot of the stories from I Know Why the Caged Birds Sing. And if I didn't have such a great memory, I might have enjoyed these books better. Like I do have a very, very good memory for plot. So like, even though I read these books years apart, I like remembered them, and it felt very much like I was being told the same stories. And these are poetry, but it's poetry that is always interrupted by like introduction. And like some cases I really love that. In this part, I felt like I could never get into the flow of the poems, and it's also poem style that I'm not a huge fan of. But like, you know, I think that it is interesting and says a lot of important things. I just didn't love all of the things about it. And I also read it as an audiobook, which sometimes poetry is harder to hear that way. So alas, I gave it 3 stars. I think that had some interesting stuff, but I'm kind of looking forward to something different from Jesse Thistle in the future. And then last, but certainly not least, I read Ducks, 2 Years in the Oil Sands by Kate Beaton. And this book blew me away. One of my favorite books. I read most of it in January, and then my hold like elapsed, and I like literally freaked out. I think I've told this story before, but like I was sitting there on like a Sunday afternoon, and like it had said like one day, so I thought it was like due the next day, and I only had like 70 pages left, and I like gasped so much that my roommate looks over and goes, "Did Maggie Smith die?" And I was like, "No, Maggie Smith didn't die." Which, you know, she's the woman who would kill me the most, and I know she's gonna die, and it's all sad. Anyways, that was my gasp, and then I had to wait like 2.5 months before I finished it. So I did finish it in April, but I read most of it in January. So there was like a little bit of that discount, but it really looks at what it means to be a woman in a primarily like male dominated space. And I'm telling you, I've been in that situation, not for 2 years, but I have dealt with so much of the things that she dealt with, and I felt very, very represented. And it takes place in like 2005, 2008, I think, kind of time, during the time in which like I was growing up. I knew many people and many men, especially, who went to the oil sands in Alberta, because it's talking about how like she's in Nova Scotia where there's very little jobs, and you have to go to Alberta to like get rich and stuff like that. And she does it to like pay off her student loans because she's an artist and she wants to be a writer and she wants to do all these things, but she doesn't want to have this like debt hanging over her. And like she does it, and the experiences on them really shape who she is, and like the experiences of like what isolation and toxic masculinity and stuff all do, as well as the impact from the environment. And I just think that it's a really phenomenal book about Canada and about the experience of Canada. It's a memoir, and it's like so well done. It just won Canada Reads, and I'm really, really happy to see it win and to be highlighted in graphic novels, to like really be represented and celebrated, because her art is very simple and very good, and also deals with like sexual harassment and sexual assault. I really appreciate that when a sexual assault happens, what happens is the lead up, and then we see these 3 black panels, and we go and we go again. And I was reading it digitally, so I was just scrolling, and it was black, and it was black, and it was black. And then we go to the next day, and there's not a representation of that sexual assault, but we all know what happens, and there's conversation between friends and between family members about what it is, but it also looks at people who haven't gone through that and how impossible it is to talk about it. And it's a really, really powerful book, and I read so many lovely books in April, and I'm just so thankful for these books, and so many Canadian books that just make me happy. Anyways, let me know what book you felt represented, like what genre or like niche do you think should be like better represented, like graphic memoirs and stuff, and I would love to hear from you next time.